Hey, grade sevens, welcome to lesson 3.2. The British crossed the Atlantic. Why did they come here to North America to build colonies? Stick around and let's learn something. Why did the British build colonies in North America? Welcome everybody to lesson 3.2. This is the British cross the Atlantic. France, which we learned about in chapter 2, the last chapter that we did, they weren't the only empire that was crossing the Atlantic to find riches. We've got Britain, Spain, Portugal, these countries, these empires as well. They were crossing the Atlantic. They also wanted to find riches. The richer you are, the more powerful your empire is going to be. So that was everybody's goal at the time. And you can see here, I've got a graphic here, an image. We've got the Union Jack is built from the flag of England, the flag of Scotland, and the flag of Northern Ireland. And that is the Union Jack. So we want to colonize America. Well, the very first English explorer to try and build a colony in the New World, I'm using air quotations, in North America was Walter Raleigh. So he tried to build a colony, and he tried twice, 1585 and again in 1587. Both of these attempts to build a colony failed because of the wilderness that was there in North America and the harsh life that greeted and waited these colonists that came over. And Britain wanted to build a colony because of the economy, competition, the quality of life, and religious freedom. So let's take a look at those four in a little bit more detail. So when it comes to the economy, Britain wanted in on this race because the other three imperial nations at the time, the empires at the time, Spain, France, and Portugal, they were making a lot of money from the discoveries of North America. So obviously, Britain wanted to do the same. Competition is the second reason to build a colony. Britain was in competition with all the other empires, so France and Spain in particular, and Britain, just like the other empires, wanted to expand their empire, wanted to expand their power. Quality of life is the third reason. British cities, these were old cities, they were overcrowded. Many of them were walled cities, which you will learn about next year in grade 8 social. And there was very little good farmland left for regular everyday people to farm. So the colonies, or calling it, is like, oh, this is a great reason to go. We can go and we can have a fresh start over in the colonies that will increase and better our quality of life. And then the fourth reason was for religious freedoms. So in Britain, there were many minority groups like the Quakers, the Puritans, and the Baptists. And what ended up happening is they were being treated very poorly in Britain. So if they could go to the colonies, they're making a fresh start. Their quality of life is going to improve. They can practice their religion freely because the colonies really, they didn't care. But there's a problem. Colonies, as we know, are very expensive. So we have King James I of England. He knew that creating and maintaining colonies are going to be super expensive. So he granted private groups the opportunity to pay for and set up colonies. Very similar to what we learned about in chapter 2 with the monopolies and the fur trade. So what do we have? Well, we have the creation of the 13 colonies. So over time, eventually, you can see here that the 13 colonies are established. And over time, they split into 13 different colonies. And altogether, they are known as New England. To begin, each was very unique. They had their own structure, they had their own religious groups, they had their own governments, They were running independent of each other, but they were still similar in that they were colonies of the British Empire. And the economies there were based on what they were producing. So take, for example, Virginia. The economy of Virginia was based on tobacco. And in England, in Britain, tobacco was very popular, just like fur was for the French fur traders. So everything that was being produced, we have those products heading over, and now this is being sold, and it makes your economy stronger. Okay. Now, some colonies settled because of religious freedoms, like the Pilgrims in Plymouth in Massachusetts. They settled because of religious freedoms. So they were free to practice their religion. So that's where they settled. And then eventually others came. They cleared farmland. They raised cattle. They fished. And they did all those kinds of things. And along the same time, we've got New France developing. And the colonies of New France are trying to take off. So they were settled around the same time. And you can see here on this chart, on this table, the years there, they began around the same time. But New England grew a lot quicker than New France did. They had different reasons to colonize than France, and they had different goals, and they had different systems to run the colonies than what New France was doing. And you can see here on this table, on this chart, that the population of the 13 colonies was growing way faster than that of New France. So there is 5 factors that contributed to the popularity of the 13 colonies and the fact that they were growing quicker. Well, the first one is that they had different goals. In New France, France itself was not interested in spending heavily on colonies. The priority for France and for New France was collecting furs and other natural resources. So your timber, your fish, and your metals. This is what they wanted. The 13 colonies had a different goal than New France. In New France, France was not investing heavily, but Britain in the colonies was investing money. They wanted to establish large settlements because the larger the settlements, the better military you have, and you have an economic advantage over all of the other imperial countries at the time. So they had different goals to start up the colonies. The second reason why the 13 colonies grew a lot faster was the climate. In New France, and you can see on the image here, the St. Lawrence Valley in Acadia, the climate was extreme. The winters were cold and long, and really most of the year is very difficult to farm in that area. So if you can't farm, what are your people going to do? It makes it very hard for them to earn a living. But that cold meant more beavers. And at the time when the fur trade was super important to the economy of France, this was the perfect spot to get those beavers so that they could get those thick furs over to France. And that's what France really wanted at the time. But the climate of the 13 colonies was different. The climate was mild, especially the further south you go. In the south, farms flourished all year long, so you didn't have to worry about the cold. And because the climate was much more tolerable, it made life much more comfortable. Just think about when it gets cold. How does the cold here, how does the winter affect your quality of life, right? It's a little bit more difficult to do the things that you enjoy. The third thing, employment. We talked about this already with the goals and climate, but in New France, employment was all based on the fur trade. So your First Nation trappers, the coureurs de bois, the fur traders, they ran all the employment opportunities that were there. There were very few other opportunities to make a living because everything was revolved around the fur trade. But in the 13 colonies, everything mainly was based on your farming, your fishing, and your logging. So that meant you had much more opportunities, many more opportunities to make a living because you've got employment and you've got a job that you can make money from to meet your basic needs. The fourth reason that the 13 colonies were more successful and grew faster than New France was for religious reasons. New France only allowed French Catholics to go to New France. So that's going to limit the amount of people that are coming. But the 13 colonies, however, they didn't care. You could be of any faith and you could come to the 13 colonies and you can settle. And you didn't even have to be from Britain. You could have been from any country that you wanted and you can make your way over. So we see here, this is the predominant religions of the 13 colonies. This is later in the 1700s. But we've got members of all faiths there and from different countries as well. And the fifth reason why the 13 colonies expanded a lot faster than that of New France was because of trade. In New France, you could only trade with the home country, which was France. All trade at the time was revolving around the fur trade, and only a handful of companies, if that, had a monopoly on that trade. So it's going to focus your economy on just that one resource. Now, there was timber and fish and metals and stuff like that, but the fur trade was the main commodity being traded. The 13 colonies, however, they had a very robust trade network. And initially, yes, they were only allowed to trade with Britain, but then over time they could trade with other countries as well. And that means if you can trade with other countries, then you can start a business for whatever you want, and you can grow or produce whatever you want for yourself, for your family, for your community, and then as well you can produce for profit too. And you can see here on the map all of the different industries that we're developing. We've got ships, we've got the metals, we've got rum, we've got livestock, we still have furs, yes. We've got crops, we've got copper, we've got shipbuilding again, tobacco, that's a big one, lots of tobacco, there's rice, there's silks, naval supplies, there's lumber. The 13 colonies have a lot of opportunity to trade. And that's why the 13 colonies, that's why they grew a lot quicker than that of New France, and their population exploded. If we take a look at Canada today, well, our population right now is approximately 38 million people. And the United States has a population of approximately 330 million people. That is a lot of people. And you can still see on the map that's listed here, the population of both countries, the majority of the people do live along the eastern seaboard. Okay, so where the 13 colonies originally set up. And then you can see on the Pacific side, we have some larger cities there as well. In the United States, you got Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. There are a lot of people there. And the majority of Canada's population is going to be in the southern Ontario as well as along the St. Lawrence region. But definitely the vast majority of the population does reside in the United States along that Atlantic coast there. And you can see here, the further north you go and the further you go into the interior, the populations are going to be a lot smaller. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.